He went under the water at 9:30 in the morning, and he was supposed to be back by evening. The alarm was raised at 9:30 that night. What followed? 9 days, 4 countries, blasting work above the cave, and all of France waiting for a signal from an air pocket 800 meters from the entrance. Eric Establier was considered one of the best cave divers in the world, and he was a volunteer with the rescue service himself. On the 3rd of October, 2010, in the sump of the Dragonnière de Gaud, the clay came down behind him. What did the rescuers find beyond the blockage? And why did the instruments later contradict the entire operation? Eric Establier was born on the 30th of September, 1964, in Neuilly-sur-Seine, a quiet suburb of Paris. From that place to the underground rivers of southern France is more or less his whole life. As an adult, he settled on the Mediterranean coast and opened a company in Cannes doing marine and underwater work, inspecting quays, repairing structures below the waterline, all the things professional divers do for money. By training and by turn of mind, he was also a hydrogeologist, a man who understands how water moves inside rock. That detail matters for everything that follows. Establier was not an amateur who straps on a tank at the weekend. Diving was his trade. He went under the water on weekdays, on the job, and he knew the inside of that world the way a man knows it when it pays his bills. At the same time, he spent more than 20 years going underground. He belonged to the caving club of Saint-Vallier-de-Thiers, a small group in the south of the country, and he gradually moved into the hardest specialty cavers have, the underwater one. That means sumps, sections of a cave where the passage is completely flooded, and the only way on is to swim, on breathing gear, in total darkness, often at serious depth. In the French community, they talked about him briefly and without qualifiers, one of the strongest cave divers on the planet. What they singled out was not so much strength or technique as composure, the ability not to rush in an emergency and to take decisions in order. In this profession, a reputation like that is not handed out in advance. You earn it over years and confirm it on every single dive. Sources disagree about his age. Going by his date of birth, he was 46 when he died. Part of the press at the time wrote 45. A small discrepancy, but a telling one. Even on the basic numbers in this story, the sources do not always line up. What exactly he did underground? Without that, nothing further makes sense. Establier's specialty was deep sumps, and that does not mean a couple of meters of water between 2 dry chambers that an experienced person crosses in a minute. It means flooded galleries hundreds of meters long and tens of meters deep. A dive like that is done on a rebreather, a closed-circuit unit. An ordinary scuba set dumps your exhaled breath into the water. A rebreather processes it, strips out the carbon dioxide, adds oxygen, and sends the mix back to you. The gas lasts for many hours instead of tens of minutes. Establier carried 2 of these units, the second one as a reserve, because in a sump, there is nobody to turn to for help. Plus an underwater scooter, a small electric motor with a propeller that the diver holds onto. It pulls a person along a long gallery, saving both energy and gas. Without one, the far reaches of the Dragonnière de Gaud are simply out of range. This specialty comes with hard limits that no amount of willpower or experience gets around. On a dive like that, you count your gas supply in hours, not minutes. And a large share of those hours is already committed to the ascent. Coming up from 70 meters cannot be hurried. Surfacing too fast is dangerous in itself, so you need stops stretched over tens of minutes. The second enemy is sediment. The floors and walls of the sumps in the Ardèche are coated in a thick layer of clay and sand. One movement of a fin is enough to turn the water into an opaque suspension. Visibility drops to 0, and you cannot see your hands in front of the mask. The only reference point left at that moment is the guideline, a thin cord strung from the entrance. The diver holds it between his fingers and moves by feel. Choosing this specialty means agreeing to one simple condition. You cannot leave a sump upward, you cannot leave sideways, and you cannot wait for help. The only way back is the same way you came. Establier worked inside that condition for more than 20 years. From 2006, Establier took on a second role, and it changes the angle on everything else. He joined Spéléo Secours Français, the French cave rescue service, as a volunteer. It is not built like an urban emergency service. There is no permanent staff of professionals on duty at the cave entrance. The people who know how to get others out from underground are cavers themselves. The service keeps lists of volunteers by department and calls them out from all over the country. Some specialize in moving a stretcher through tight passages, some in rope work in shafts, some in getting a signal through solid rock. Establier fell into the narrowest category of all, the people you call when the accident happened beyond a sump. There are not many of them in France. The count runs in the dozens, and they all know one another personally. An ordinary rescuer simply cannot enter a flooded gallery. That takes a person with years of underwater practice and the right equipment. In 2009, he took part in the search for a missing diver in the Ressel Cave, in the Lot Department. The Ressel is a well-known sump that divers travel to from all over Europe, and working there means exactly what it says, looking for a colleague who did not come out. This side of his biography often drops out of the retellings, and it is the key one. By the autumn of 2010, Establier knew underground searches from the inside. He had a clear picture of how long it takes to assemble a team, how gas limits are calculated, what the equipment can actually do, and why a person beyond a sump sometimes cannot be reached at all. He had seen it with his own eyes and taken part in it with his own hands. A little over a year later, that same service, with the same people and the same procedure, would be called out for him. And many of those who came to the Ardèche would be searching not for some abstract missing diver, but for a man they knew, someone they had worked alongside. Now for the place. The river Ardèche runs through a deep limestone canyon, and in the right-hand wall of that canyon, 12 meters above the water, the Dragonnière spring opens up. The landmark is a sharp bend in the river near the hamlet of Gaud. It is protected land, and you cannot drive up to the entrance. Gear is ferried across the river, and in summer, the ford is chest deep. The entrance looks unremarkable. Right behind it, a passage begins that goes straight under the water, and from there, the whole cave is one continuous sump. It was taken generation by generation, in pieces. In 1978, Jean-Marc Mat pushed the terminal sump 150 meters and stopped at a depth of 38. A year later, he and a partner moved the limit out to 200 meters and 50 meters down. In April of 1980, the Swiss diver Olivier Eisler came here, one of the leading figures in European cave diving, reached 220 meters and ran into a shaft at 66. Then, a pause of almost a decade. In '89, Patrick Jolivet went back to the end of the passage, and in May of '97, he and Marc Chocat pushed on to 300 meters and 68 down. The real breakthrough came from Patrick Brunet's team. In '99, Brunet and Christophe Dupin re-rigged the passage and surveyed down to 79 meters. In the summer of 2000, they took the total length of the cave to roughly 880 meters, about 400 of them underwater, and the maximum depth went out to 88. How is this sump built physically? It follows a fissure about 4 meters wide, squeezing down in places to a window 2 meters by 1.5, then leveling out at around -70. The walls and the floor are caked with clay and loose sediment, centimeters of it, more in places. The material here does not hold its shape. It lies in layers that are ready to move. Over more than 30 years, the best divers in Europe passed through this cave. Each of them added another 100 or 200 meters and left. Establier's turn came in the spring of 2008. On the 5th and 6th of April, a team of 8 gathered at the entrance to the Dragonnière de Gaud. Among them were Establier himself and Frank Vasseur, another well-known name in French cave diving, the author of countless descriptions of the flooded caves of the South. In 2 days of work, they pushed the explored section out by 260 meters. The endpoint moved to roughly 680 meters from the entrance. To understand the weight of that number, it helps to remember the previous 30 years. Made added 150 meters in his day, Eisler 70, Jolivet and Chocat 80, and here, 260 meters in a single trip, in a sump that deep. Not a routine outing, but a serious step forward. Every meter here is paid for in hours under the water, in cylinders carried in relay, and in a long decompression on the way out. After that, the cave stopped being someone else's object from someone else's reports. He knew it himself, by hand. Where the fissure narrows, where the clay starts, how the guideline lies. The Dragonnière de Gaud became his personal project, the kind of place you come back to. But pushing forward has a flip side. The The passage grows faster than it gets described. Reports from different teams over 30 years were made with different methods and different accuracy, and no single reliable picture of the far section existed. There was a length, there were depths, there was a rough direction, and there was no map you could rely on. Surveying under the water is slow, thankless work. The diver moves in short legs. On each one, he measures the distance along the guideline, the depth on his gauge, and the bearing on his compass, writes it all on a plastic slate, and moves to the next section. Progress drops several times over, gas consumption goes up, and what you bring to the surface is not a record, but a column of figures. That was the job Establier set himself next in the Dragonnière de Gaud. 2.5 years passed between that trip and his last dive, and he filled them. In November of 2009, he restarted the exploration of the Platane Spring, another flooded cavity in the same Ardèche Gorge, abandoned by other teams. He also worked in the Mescla caves in the gorges of the Var department. The same handwriting everywhere. Take an underdocumented site and bring it to a clear state. There was more behind this than the thrill of going first. As a hydrogeologist, Establier looked at a cave differently from a sportsman. For him, the flooded galleries were not an end in themselves, but part of a system that carries water through limestone and brings it back out at the springs. To understand where a passage leads is to understand where a river is fed from and how. A map here solves a practical problem. A survey lets you lay the underground passage over the surface, work out which part of the plateau it runs beneath, at what depth, where it turns. Without those numbers, a cave exists only as a set of impressions belonging to the people who have been inside it. And there is a second function that the caving community talks about openly. A map is a working tool for rescuers. If something happens underground, that is what you use to work out where to look for a person, where you might try to drill a borehole, and whether there is any chance of coming at it from another side. As a Speleo Secours volunteer, Establier knew that better than most. In the Dragonnière de Gaud, there was no reliable map of the far section. The passage had been traveled. It had not been described. The work ahead was painstaking and had nothing to show for it. No record, no new meters, only measurements on a stretch that was already known. Dives like that do not make the news and do not get discussed on forums. People do them because somebody has to. He planned the survey for the autumn of 2010. A few days after his death, the absence of that map would become one of the main problems of the rescue operation. The rescuers would be looking for a man in a gallery whose exact geometry nobody knew. On the 30th of September, 2010, he turned 46. 3 days later, he arrived in the Ardèche Gorge, a Sunday morning at the start of October. The best time of year in this area. The tourist season is over, the river is low, the ford is no trouble at all. The gear was carried to the entrance across the river. 2 rebreathers, cylinders, a scooter, survey instruments. Not a rucksack over the shoulder, but several trips with a load. The plan for the day was clear and agreed in advance. Go down into the sump, get to the far section, and run a topographic survey there. No pushing forward, no attempt to set a new limit, only measurements on a stretch that was already known. He went under alone. Cave divers at this level work that way regularly. In a narrow, deep gallery, a partner does less helping than hindering, stirring up sediment, tangling the guideline, burning shared gas. The practice of solo dives into far sumps is contested and has been argued over in the community for decades, but it is widespread, and Establier followed it. A support team was waiting for him on the surface. The configuration was set up for many hours of work. 2 closed-circuit units, reserve cylinders, a scooter, a gas supply calculated for an unhurried exit, and long stops on the way up. All of it put together by a man who had done this dozens of times and worked out his reserves professionally. At 9:30, he went into the water. What happens next, for an observer on the surface, looks like empty waiting. The entrance to a sump is just a water level, below which nothing can be seen or heard. There is no communication. The only thing left for the team above is to hold the expected exit time in their heads and wait. There was nothing exceptional about this dive. A familiar cave, a familiar passage, a routine task, an experienced man, the right equipment, and good weather. That is how this story begins. Completely ordinary. What happened inside was reconstructed afterwards from fragments, from what the rescuers found, from instrument data, and from the geometry of the passage itself. There are no direct witnesses. The far part of the sump runs as a gallery with clay walls and a loose floor. It is not a stone tunnel with solid sides, but a slot in the limestone packed with sediment that has been building up here for thousands of years. Material like that holds as long as nobody touches it, and holds very badly when something nearby changes. At about 780 meters from the entrance, the ground moved. The passage was closed off by a plug of gravel and clay. The speleosecours reports would later call this silting, caused by a slump of the ground. What exactly set the movement off has still not been established. There are two versions. The first is a natural shift of sediment that could have happened on any day and happened on this one. The second is the passage of the diver himself. A scooter throws out a flow of water that may have undercut a loose slope. Neither version has been confirmed, and there is no official conclusion on the cause of the collapse. The result does not depend on the cause. Between Establier and the exit, there was now a mass of gravel and clay, covering the only way back. According to the investigation, he spent about 2 hours trying to find a way around. 2 hours in a flooded gallery, where the water after a collapse is almost certainly clouded, is methodical work. Examine the obstacle, check whether there is a parallel passage, try a different level, come back. That is how a man with 20 years behind him works. He does not thrash about. He works through the options. There was no way around. The gallery is closed at that point. He remained beyond the plug, at a depth of around 70 meters, at the lowest point of the flooded passage. The plug sits 780 meters from the entrance. The place where he would later be located is about 70 meters further on from the blockage. In some reports, the figures differ. There, the count runs from the start of the sump rather than the cave entrance, and it comes out at around 900 meters. The spread is explained by different starting points, not by different places. Up above, by this time, it was already dark. An October day in the canyon is short. The sun goes behind the wall of the gorge early, and the support team sat by the water with torches. The expected exit time had passed. On deep dives, a delay of an hour or two is not yet a catastrophe. Decompression can run long, the work can take longer than planned. But hour followed hour, and the surface of the water at the entrance stayed still. At 9:30 in the evening on the 3rd of October, the Speleosecours Francais rescue plan was activated. A machine starts up that works like a phone tree. The duty officer for the department calls out his own people. They call the neighboring departments, and the information goes up to national level, because this is an underwater case, which means rare specialists are needed. At the same time, the gendarmerie and the fire service head for the canyon. A camp goes up. Generators and lighting are brought in. The location complicates everything. The entrance is 12 meters above the river. There is no road access. The land is protected. Every cylinder, every bag of rope, every cable is carried across the river by hand. At 3:30 in the morning, 6 hours after the alarm, 2 rescue divers went into the sump. The task of the first reconnaissance was simple. Follow the guideline and see whether Establier was in the near section, in case he was conscious and waiting for help at an intermediate stop. They went down to 52 meters. No trace. By this point, there were 26 rescuers of the French Cave Rescue Service on site. For the following day, they planned a reconnaissance out to at least 490 meters from the entrance, twice as far. On the surface, meanwhile, nobody knew anything. Not about the collapse, not about where he had stopped, not even whether he had reached the far section at all. There was only empty water at the entrance, 800 meters of the unknown behind it, and a man about whom everyone present knew one thing. If anybody could get himself out from underground, it was him. By the evening of the 4th of October, a second reconnaissance reached 450 meters from the entrance. Establier was not found. A phrase appeared in the rescuer's report that would set the logic for everything afterwards. A negative result does not cancel the hope of finding him alive beyond the flooded section. The calculation was built on an air pocket. In karst caves, a flooded gallery often runs not level, but in waves. Somewhere the passage rises towards the ceiling, and a pocket of air is left under the roof, cut off by water on both sides. Cavers call places like the air bells. A person who comes up into a pocket like that can take off the mask and breathe. There is not much air. It is damp and cold, but with a gas supply and minimal movement, it is realistic to hold out not for hours, but for days. That is what everyone was betting on. If Establier had not been met on the way, then he had gone further, and most likely he was sitting in a cavity like that. At 5:30 in the morning on the 5th of October, British and Swiss specialists arrived on site. The French authorities had requested the British by name, John Valanthin and Rick Stanton, from the South and Mid Wales Cave Rescue Team. By that point, both were world-class figures in pushing long sumps, with experience of working where everyone else turns around. During the day, they prepared a serious dive. It was scheduled for 3 in the afternoon, and the duration was estimated at 5 to 9 hours, counting the way in, the work on site, and the long decompression on the way out. The British took an emergency first aid kit with them and through-rock communication equipment. That is a system that sends a signal not along a wire, but straight through the stone to a receiver above. They hauled it under the water in case the man was found alive, and contact had to be established with him. At 3:30 in the afternoon, they went into the water. The whole site was left waiting on the surface, and by evening, the national news was following the operation. At 4 in the morning, Valanthin and Stanton came out of the water after many hours of work and brought back the first solid information in 3 days. At 780 meters from the entrance, the passage is closed off. A plug of gravel and clay, the result of the ground shifting. Beyond that, the gallery does not continue, at least not for a person and equipment. And in the same spot, beneath the blockage, they found Establier's spare scooter. That detail instantly changed the mood on site. The rescuers read it as a sign left deliberately. He had reached this point, understood that he was shut in, and left the scooter at the plug as a marker for whoever came after him. And if he had left it and moved on, then he had moved on to somewhere it was possible to be, which meant the air pocket beyond the blockage really did exist. The conclusion went into the official report. There are grounds to believe that he is alive and has found shelter. The logic of the operation turned around. Until then, they had been looking for a man in a gallery. Now, they were looking for a way to break through to a living man, through an obstacle that would not let even the best divers in Europe past. At 12:30 in the afternoon, the work front moved above ground. Machinery was brought onto the plateau over the cave, and they began opening up the ground from the surface. The idea being to go down vertically to the underground cavities and reach the gallery from above, bypassing the water. At the same time, they surveyed a neighboring cave where air movement had been noted. An airflow means a connection to a large cavity somewhere deep inside. By this point, the work was running around the clock. Some were breaking rock on the plateau, others were preparing the next dive, others were ferrying gear across the river. By 8 in the evening, they had finished bringing in everything needed for the next day's dive. The plan for the 6th and 7th is spelled out in the report, almost word for word. Assess the plug at 780 meters and find a way around it. Nobody on site doubted that somewhere behind that clay, a man was sitting and waiting. The Swiss went in to assess the obstacle. On the morning of the 7th of October, 2 of them headed for the plug, started work at 20 to 12, and came back in the evening with a conclusion that broke the whole scheme. The wording in the report is precise and bleak. The block section is a funnel, whose walls consist of clay and suspension. In practice, that means the following. A collapse made of rock can, in theory, be dismantled. You pull out one block, then another, and the passage grows. Clay and suspension does not work that way. It does not hold its shape. Whatever you take out is immediately pulled back in by the mass beside it. You are digging in porridge that refills itself. On top of that, instant zero visibility. Any movement raises the silt, and the diver works blind at a depth of around 46 meters, 780 meters from the way out, on a hard time limit. The conclusion, for a human being, the plug is impassable. Attempts to get through it directly were stopped. This is a hard moment in the operation. The best divers in Europe, assembled in one place within 2 days, admitted that their main instrument was useless here. They started going through everything else. They discussed robots, remotely operated underwater vehicles able to get into places a person cannot. They discussed drilling from the surface, sink a borehole straight into the presumed cavity, and at least establish contact. On the plateau, they carried on opening the vertical shaft. By evening, it had gone down 16 meters. The work used explosives. There is no other way to take limestone. Italian specialists arrived. By the 8th of October, they left. It was becoming clear that the problem came down not to the number of hands, but to one specific underwater section. And what was needed there were divers. On the 8th, the Swiss teams prepared equipment for work further beyond the plug. Through the night, the digging on the plateau continued. There were about 30 Spéléo Secours rescuers on site, not counting the gendarmerie, the fire service, the machinery, and the press. It was day 5. On the evening of the 9th, the British came up to the surface at 5:30 and brought out of the sump an object that the site would take as an answer. It was a Stablier's cylinder found at the blockage. The report notes separately, this cylinder had not been there on the previous dive. The conclusion followed immediately. It meant the man beyond the plug was not only alive, but able to move. He had reached the air cavity, then come back to the blockage and left the cylinder, the only way of signaling available to him. After 6 days of fruitless work, news like that changed everything. The rescuers were no longer building assumptions. They were holding an object that had appeared there within the last 24 hours. They acted accordingly. Overnight, they prepared a delivery: emergency supplies, communication equipment, extra cylinders of breathing mix. On the 10th of October, the Swiss divers carried all of it out to the plug and left it where a person on the other side could reach it. At 6 in the evening, they came out. On the surface, a round-the-clock watch was set up at the communication gear. Somebody sat in headphones at all times, listening to the rock, in case a signal came from below. At the same time, the work above carried on. The shaft on the plateau went 21 meters deeper. A full drilling operation was being prepared. The target at a depth of around 200 meters, at a distance of between 1,300 and 1,500 meters from the cave entrance. There was no precise data about a cavity there, only calculations, and that same missing map. In those days, the story went far beyond the Ardèche. The national television channels of France were covering the operation, and the entire world community of cave divers was following it. The man missing was not a tourist, but one of the best in the profession, and the people trying to save him were of the same caliber. On paper, the situation looked encouraging. Contact was about to be made, supplies had been delivered, the drilling was being prepared, and a fresh signal was lying at the blockage. Up on the plateau, the digging ran all through the night into the 11th of October. By morning, they had driven shafts of 20, 40, and another 20 meters, about 90 meters into the limestone in total. And there the work ran into rock again, with nothing at hand to take it out quickly. Day 8. On site, they started counting out loud. Even in the best case, the gas supply in an air pocket is not infinite, and the cold in the cave works against a person constantly. The water temperature in these sumps holds at around 12 degrees, and hypothermia arrives sooner than the breathing mix runs out. On the evening of the 11th of October, the British divers finally found a way around and reached the place where Eric Establier's route had ended. He is about 70 meters beyond the blockage that cut off his exit, at the lowest point of the flooded gallery, at a depth of around 70 meters, from the cave entrance that is roughly 850 meters. In the Spéléo Secours report that evening, they wrote about him briefly. The elite, and a benchmark of underwater caving. The operation was wound down within 24 hours. On the 12th of October, after a meeting of the services, the prosecutor's office took the decision not to recover the body. The wording was official and, in its own way, honest. The overall severity of the conditions, the difficulty of the task, the risk to people, and the scale of involvement that would be required, that decision is easy to condemn from the outside and hard to argue with on the merits. To bring a person out from 70 meters of depth, past a funnel of clay, through 800 meters of flooded passage, you would have had to send the same divers in many more times, and each of those trips carried its own price. The same day they made a final dive, collecting the equipment out of the sump so that nothing would be left in the cave. By the morning of the 13th of October, the teams were leaving. The camp by the river was packed up. While the camp in the Ardèche was being taken down, the investigation was only beginning. It was led by the prosecutor of the city of Privas, Christophe Raffin. The main source of data was Establier's dive computer. That device keeps a log automatically: depth, time, temperature, second by second. From it, you can reconstruct not testimony and not guesswork, but the factual chronicle of what happened under the water. The device shows that Establier died 5 hours and 20 minutes after the start of the dive. The count runs from 9:30 in the morning on the 3rd of October, the moment the descent began, which means it was all over the same day, closer to 3 in the afternoon, 6.5 hours before anyone on the surface even raised the alarm. Of those 5 hours and a bit, He spent about 2 on attempts to get around the blockage, stubbornly, to the very end. And from that follows a conclusion that changes the meaning of the whole story. 9 days of a national rescue operation, hundreds of man-hours under the water, blasting on the plateau, deliveries of emergency supplies, around-the-clock watch at the communication gear, specialists arriving from 4 countries. All of it was heading towards a man who had not been alive since the first evening. The air bell that everyone was betting on was not there in that part of the gallery. One question is left without an answer. The scooter beneath the blockage, and especially the cylinder that had not been there on the previous dive, were read by the rescuers as signals from a living man. That does not square with the dive computer data. No official explanation for the finds was given. The data is contradictory. The most cautious reading is that the equipment may have been shifted by movements of the clay and by flows of water, and that some of the items simply emerged from the sediment between dives. But that is only a supposition. What happened to Establier after no way around was found? There is no data. The device records depth and time, not decisions. The French caving community did not accept the prosecutor's decision. On the 23rd of October, 2010, an operation started under the name Solidarité Eric Establier. Solidarity for Eric Establier. The idea went around the water. If he could not be reached through the sump, then it was worth trying from another side, from above and from the flank, through the Puy-de-Dôran's shaft near the village of La Bastide de Viras. The reasoning was that the underground passages are connected and that somewhere there is a dry route through to the same gallery. More than 100 volunteer cavers came for that work, from dozens of departments across France. People took time off and went to dig in someone else's cave. The work ran all autumn and winter. The first sump was passed and pumped dry, with a relay of pumps built up over tens of meters underground. The second turned out to be harder. 20 meters long, 60 centimeters high, and a meter wide, a crawl filled with water and packed with sand. They took more than 2 cubic meters of sediment out of it, over 4 tons. The tight spots were widened with explosives. On the 3rd of December, the second sump was finally bypassed. Beyond it, a gallery opened up with a dry, sandy floor, and a chamber 8 to 10 meters across. For the first time in the whole effort, people got into a new part of the system. On the 15th and 16th of December, the divers reached the 3rd sump and came up against a final wall. It runs through solid rock and narrows so quickly that there is no way through. They noticed a gallery hanging some 15 meters above it and moved their hopes there. At the end of December, the work was slowed by generator failures and the weather. On the 3rd of January, it resumed, but not for long. On the 8th of January 2011, the French Federation of Speleology announced the end of the search. The wording was simple. There was not a single passage left in the cavity that would allow anyone to reach the body. The costs of 3 months were covered entirely by voluntary donations. Eric Establier's body remained in the cave. Part of the English-language press wrote at the time that the British divers had brought him out. That does not match the official record. In the spring and summer of 2011, a memorial stone was set up at La Bastide de Virac. Family, friends, and rescuers from Spéléo Secours Français came to the ceremony, the same people he used to go out with on other people's emergencies. John Valanthin and Rick Stanton received bronze medals from the Royal Humane Society for the attempted rescue in the Ardèche Gorge. Formally, the award is for an operation that failed. They did not save the man, but for 8 days running, they went into the sump for him. This story remains one of the largest underground searches in French history, with an international team of rescuers, a drilling operation in preparation, and 3 months of volunteer digging after the official operation had been wound up. 8 years later, those same British divers would find themselves in the Tam Luang cave in Thailand, and there it would end differently. The experience gathered in the Ardèche, among other places, would work, just in a different cave and with different conditions. Establier's story is still an argument in the old debate about solo dives into far sumps. An awkward argument. He did not die because of a miscalculation, or bad equipment, or overconfidence. He was doing familiar work in a familiar place, and the collapse happened where and when nobody could have predicted it. A partner behind him, in that situation, would most likely have been shut in along with him. It also marked the limit of the technology. Clay in suspension, 780 meters from the entrance, was not beaten in a week, not by hand, not by machinery, not by robots. The exact cause of the ground movement in the gallery has never been established. Eric Establier died in a cave he had helped to open, on a stretch he went into not for a record and not for new meters, but for a map, the very map that the Dragonnière de Gaud was missing when they started looking for him.